Good afternoon. Welcome back. Welcome to PSU. Welcome to the Native American Student and Community Center here on the PSU campus. I am not a PSU faculty member, but I love playing one on television. So we've been listening to the dulcet tones of Paul Desmond and Jim Hall over there. Thank you, David. As some of you know, in my other life, I'm a jazz musician, so I always love hearing nice music. Want to thank you for coming out again. It's great to see you all. As you all know, for many of you who've been coming year in and year out to this series, I love this series. I love all of you for being engaged in, as we were just saying, civic and civil dialogue on complex issues, something that we need to keep in front of us as a discipline. It is a discipline, and we need to flex on maintaining it as a discipline now and into the future. So thanks. I want to make a few quick announcements. If you are wondering what is coming up and you can't remember because you registered for something 2 months ago, I've got this flyer that is sitting over on the table over here, and it tells you who's speaking on what. Other things to consider: if you have a spare room in your house and you want to engage with the future of global leadership, we are hosting a group of young Algerian leaders here in our community during the summertime, looking for homestays for them. These are phenomenal projects. You will create connections that will last a lifetime. Is that not true, Leslie Brunker? I feel really lucky to have been able to work on these projects over a number of years. And it just reminds us why we do what we do, which is connecting to the world and connecting the world to us. And I'm pretty darn excited that we're back doing that again. That is also on the table over there. What else is on the table over there? We have Great Decisions books, $35 for you from Good Family today only. Jesse and Derek can help you with that if you would like to get one. It is sort of like following along with, you go to the game and you buy the program so you know who the players are. But these are the chapters that I ask our speakers to either riff on or maybe sometimes just outright destroy. Because that is part of the dialogue, is a critical examination of the topics. I think our speakers today are probably not going to destroy them, but I think they're going to give us plenty of food for thought. Before I make the rest of my announcements, I'm going to invite my colleague Jesse Richards up here, our development director, to talk about something else that is on the table.
Yes. We're all in this together, working together to bring people together, to be a nonpartisan organization that promotes the public understanding of international relations, models informed civil discourse, and builds up communities of belonging throughout the region, both in Oregon and Southwest Washington. And 75 years ago, when WorldOregon was founded, it was founded by a group of intellectuals concerned about isolationism and how it might take hold of the region and catalyze hatred for people that are different, people that have different viewpoints or opposing viewpoints, or are part of opposing political communities. And so the World Affairs Councils of Oregon was started, much before that. But WorldOregon was really founded by this group of intellectuals 75 years ago, who said the region needs a civil society bridge to bring people together and to ensure that informed civil discourse is promoted, catalyzed, scaled, and spread throughout the region. And so this year we are celebrating 75 years together. It really is something to clap for, certainly. One of the ways we'll be celebrating is at Bridge Together, which is April 30th at the Patricia Research Center for the Arts in Beaverton, Oregon. And so please, before you go, take a few of these postcards and consider who you might bring. Of course, you all will be there, right? Yes, of course. We'll be drinking wine and having hors d'oeuvres from a vibrant table, hearing some brief remarks from Nicholas Kristoff. But please invite your friends. We have capacity to celebrate the organization for about 550 people. and we want to fill the house. We certainly will have a wonderful program to celebrate all of our World Oregon's work over the last 75 years. But an hour before the program and an hour plus after the program, we'll be drinking and eating and mixing and mingling. And for some of you who have friends who've never been involved in World Oregon, this is a great event to bring them to. So please take some of these before you leave and give them to your friends. Thanks, Tim.
Before we get started, I'd like to remind all of us that Portland State University is located in the heart of downtown Portland, in Multnomah County, and we honor the indigenous people whose traditional and ancestral homelands we stand on: the Multnomah, the Cathlamet, Clackamas, Tumwater, Watlala bands of the Chinook, the Tualatin, Kalapuya, and many other indigenous nations of the Columbia River. It is important for us to acknowledge the ancestors of this place and to recognize that we are here because of the sacrifices forced upon them. In remembering these communities, we honor their legacy, their lives, and their descendants. I also want to call out that Great Decisions is made impossible in part with the generous support of Leslie Brunker in her mother's honor, speaking of honors and legacies, and with additional support from longtime members David Margulies and Bill and Tina Brown. And right now that brings us to today. Today we are looking at international climate cooperation in an era of geopolitical turmoil, which is a huge mouthful. And we are very, very lucky to have with us Jillian Gregg, Senior Instructor of the College of Architectural or Agricultural Sciences at Oregon State University, and Gregg Walker, Professor of Communication and Environmental Sciences, Oregon State University. And without further ado, I'm going to give the floor over to them. Reminder that when we get to Q&A, questions need to be on the mic because we are streaming live, which also means that you need to be very polite. Questions are 30 seconds or less. They have a question mark on the end of them, and they are not comments, missives, or manifestos. So without further ado, Jillian, it's all yours.
Well, I guess you can hear me. I just want to say it's really exciting for me to be here because I started this whole business as a scientist and doing lots and lots of research. I worked at the EPA doing science of climate change. And then I opened up, they had this multi-million-dollar global climate change research facility that they had to close down. And I opened it up and ran climate change research in that center for a decade before I was like, you know, we know plenty about climate change. And the big thing is we really need to get the word out. And I wrote a grant saying, okay, I'm going to, you know, there was a research component, but then there was an education component. I had to go over to OSU and say, how would I get a climate change class started and what would we do? And, you know, we had all these conversations so I could put it in this grant. And then I went off on my way and they said, well, where did you go? I said, well, I'll let you know if I get the grant. And they're like, but we can pay you to teach the class. I'm like, so let's do that. And it really wasn't until like in the, you know, mid 2010. So it's 2016, we started our class. And it feels very important to me to get the science of climate change out so people know it. So we teach, you know, I have over 1,200 undergrads a year that I teach the science of climate change. And I'm part of the climate emergency team that's based out of OSU, but it's also an international team. And so we come out with papers every year on the report of what's really going on with the state of the climate. And so I feel it's important when an exciting group like you asks that you really want to hear about the paper in person, that I'll make the trip to come up and explain to you. But then I also realized that your paper that you read is all about the COPs and the details of what's going on there. And I was like, you know, I am not the expert of that. So the expert of that really at OSU is Dr. Gregg Walker. And so I invited him to come along. So I'm here to explain the science and tell you where we're at and what an emergency it really is. And then we'll be hearing from Gregg, and then we'll be hopefully hearing from you. And just as we go along, any question at all that you have about the science, I would love to help explain. So keep that in mind. But yes, engaged civil discourse. I was taking notes during the intro. What a fabulous thing. And I'm really glad that you have climate change as one of the things, one of your topics. And I thought the paper was excellently written. So I'm glad for that. So on to what I'm talking about. So the paper that we come out with every year, it's called this year it was the 2024 State of the Climate Report, Perilous Times on Planet Earth. And I'm one of many co-authors. Dr. Bill Ripple is the main lead author on the papers each year. And we always have a group of international colleagues, depending on what areas we focus on, that join in on the paper. So let's just give you an overview of what we're going to be talking about today. I'm going to go back, since I thought it was fascinating that your discussion and your paper that you read is about the Conference of the Parties and what's going on with that, because our research really follows as a follow-on from this the warnings to humanity. And I'll explain that in just a minute. But first I'm going to talk about where our work came from. And then I'm going to talk about the work itself. And then I'm going to briefly talk about recommended solutions based on our work. And then we'll move on. Okay, so World Scientists Warning to Humanity. That's who we think we are, but this actually began, the whole concept of scientists warning humanity began back in 1992. Okay, so what happened was 1992 was the beginning, before the very, very first conference. It was called the Rio Earth Summit, where they came up with the concept of having the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So they would start to have these annual meetings to figure out what to do. So even though, this is 30 years ago, more than 30 years ago, that they're having this meeting. And at this meeting, it wasn't, they were all very concerned. What are we going to do? We've got to do something. This is time is of the essence. They had their, Severance Suzuki came, and she was 12 years old at the time, and she addressed the party, just like they had their own Greta Thunberg of the time. They had the youth people there. They're like really trying to get things off the ground. And at the same time, the Union of Concerned Scientists was there, and they came up with this article afterwards, the World Scientists Warning to Humanity. Because as scientists, we feel like the goal is we need to know what's going on. We learn all these things, but we need to get the word out to the people. And but lots of science is, okay, let's write our science articles in our science jargon and share it with other scientists. And that's really people's jobs. But this Union of Concerned Scientists were like, we're going to get the word out. And so that was the very first warning. So they got the idea to have scientist signatories, and they found 1,700 scientists that signed on to their recommendations that things are really bad and things need to change. So their main point, human beings in the natural world are on a collision course, and something has got to be done. Fundamental changes are urgent, 33 years ago. Okay, so back in 2017, we were also still very worried about the planet, and it occurred to us that there had been this scientist warning to humanity that had happened to, at that point, it was only 25 years ago. So it's like, why don't we just look at the 10 variables that they looked at in that study and see how we're doing? Like, did they make that, they put out the article, we've got to be worried, what's going on? And so we'll just look at that and see what happened with these 10 variables. And so 2 of those variables were climate related, with the temperature. And since then, temperature had gone up 0.5 degrees Celsius already. And the CO2 emissions had a 55% increase. So we hadn't made any progress at all. And in fact, of the 9 of the 10 variables, one of them was the ozone hole. And we had made progress on reducing the CFC emissions. But the other 9, which I'm not going to go into all of those, they all were just still very bad. So, so what we did is we said, well, let's see if scientists would want to sign this paper. And so one email was sent to 40 scientists and one tweet, and immediately within 48 hours, we had 1,200 signatories. And so in the end, after more time had passed, we ended up with 15,000 signatories from 184 countries, all saying this is really important and something's got to be done. So it was ultimately published in Bioscience, and it was translated into 21 different languages. Okay. So because we had all these signatories, we decided we needed to create this Alliance of World Scientists. And we ended up with 52 additional scientist warning articles, and even OSU decided to make a movie of the scientist warning. It's a 30-minute movie, and it's available at the Alliance of World Scientists website. Okay, so that was like, okay, well, this is really important. People are really realizing we need to know what's going on. So, but of those 10 variables, only 2 of them were really climate change related. And there are so many different variables, like people look at temperature and CO2 all the time, but there are all these many different indicators of planetary vital signs that we should be tracking. And we shouldn't be tracking it every quarter of a century and then wait and see, oh, nothing has happened. And so our group decided, well, we're going to look at, we found 35 different planetary vital signs. And these are things that are published every year anyway. So we can go on and look at the year by year change and keep a track of what's actually going on. So the first paper came out in 2020, and then we've done an annual update all the way until 2024. And I'm going to be telling you about what the results are now. And so that motivates us that we really need to do something. Okay. So where's what I already said, the scientists warning humanity was all different sorts of environmental issues. We were just focusing on the factors that impacted climate. And we had 35 different signs, and the initial criteria was the annual data for the globe since 1980. So we would have nearly 50 years worth of data, I guess nearly 40 years worth of data. And of those 35, we divided them into 2 categories. One was human actions, what are we doing? And then what impacts do those actions have? And I'm not going to have time to go through all of those factors, but I'm going to go through a handful of human activities, and then I'm going to go through quite a lot of climate impacts, just so you know what's going on. So, the first thing that we're doing is that we have, as of November in 2022, we did reach the 8 billion number. So the population is just steadily increasing. Then we also, at the same time, the world GDP is forever increasing. There are certainly economic downturns in 2009 and during COVID, but otherwise it's continuing to increase. Energy consumption, even though it turns out that if you look at coal over a number of years and gas over the last several years, they have leveled off, but they've leveled off. They're still at the highest ever output, and oil is still on the rise. It's rebounding since COVID, and now it's higher than it had been before. But at the same time, renewables are also at their highest ever. And so we really have begun the energy transition, and that is a great thing. Okay. Other variables that humans are doing is there's more biomass, twice the biomass on Earth of livestock than there is of humans. And in order to feed all of these animals, we have lots of slash and burn agriculture, which also leads to more CO2 emissions and less CO2 uptake from our natural vegetation. Okay, so turning now to how these things impact the environment. we see that all the different greenhouse gases are increasing and they're all at their highest ever. And that's true in every report that we show year after year. They just keep going up. But last year, things looked a bit different. So when we look at our temperatures and we see the temperatures, these are all the different years since 2000. But in 2023, in March, the North Atlantic ocean temperatures pulled way apart from everybody else. And even until the report this year, they stayed. It wasn't just a blip, that we have gone to the point where the North Atlantic ocean temperatures are just out of the range of anything that we have been seeing. But okay, and the same thing if we look at the world sea surface temperatures. Again, starting back in March, they pulled away, and that has continued. Okay, then if you move, so if you have a warmer sea temperatures, you know, the sea ice is sitting in the ocean. And, you know, if you have ice in warmer water, it's going to be melting faster. So by May of that year, we saw that the ice began to melt quite, you know, out of the range of anything we had seen before. And that, again, has continued on and through 2024. And that's true whether you look just at Antarctic ice or the world ice. So an extreme jump in the lots more melting. And if you look at the world air temperature, so you know if you have the warmer water, then the warmer water translates its heats to the air. And if you have less ice, then you have less reflection of incoming solar radiation. So both of those factors are going to lead to warmer air temperatures. And you can see by July that the air temperatures were also warmer, okay, by a leap. And then for 2023, it was when we had the Canadian wildfires, and you know, where it would be in Canada where the fires were happening, and in New York City and Ohio, people were having like, you know, bad air days. You can't even go outside, just many, you know, long ways away. So interestingly, in Canada that year, they had more emissions from wildfire smoke, higher CO2 emission from wildfires than they did from fossil fuels in that year. So forest fires are becoming a real input to our CO2 emissions that need to be considered. Okay, so with the ice melt and the warming, then of course those lead to sea level rise. Sea level rise, this is a model where they said if all of the ice on Earth melted, then this is what would happen. And it might not always be a good thing. So so the CO2, it's not just that the CO2 goes into the air and causes the greenhouse effect and that makes the globe warmer, but that same CO2 dissolves into the ocean and that causes the ocean to be acidic. In my class, when I teach it, we blow through straws into tap water and test the acidity, and you can see that the acidity goes up. And you know, Congress is often, you know, scientists take the experiment in there, so they really get the visceral feeling that the CO2 that we put in the air, it's not only warming the globe, but it is causing ocean acidification, and that ocean acidification and also the warming of the ocean is causing the coral bleaching. And we'll see later, we are in the midst of the 4th mass global bleaching event. So it's not a good situation. And that this is one of the charts from our paper where we see the CO2 is causing the reduced lower acidity in the oceans. Okay, so just a few smaller, easier to explain slides. This one is just that 2023, we did have the very highest jump in CO2. So when I was in grad school, we just calibrate our instruments to, you know, 355 parts per million CO2. and years would go by and we wouldn't say, oh, it's higher each year. We'd be there for 5 years and maybe, you'd start at 350 and then it'd be 360. But we are changing the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. It started around 1 parts per million per year, and now we're up to about 2.5 parts per million per year. And then last year it was over 3, or in 2023. So it's we're really increasing the amount of increase in CO2. And in 2024, it just came out last week that we exceeded the 1.5 threshold. Now it's not expected that next year will also. So there'll be a period of several years where we'll be bouncing around the 1.5, and 1.5 is of interest because that's the Paris Agreement dream, is that we will keep temperatures not only below 2 degrees Celsius, but hopefully well below 1.5 degrees Celsius. See how the time, oh, we need to hurry up. Okay, so the Arctic has lost over 40% of its leaf area and half of its thickness. Expected to be ice-free by mid-century, but it is, an article came out 2 weeks ago saying that the earliest the Arctic might become ice-free will be in 2027, so 2.5 years from now. Yeah, it's not saying it will, but that's the early, like it could happen in 2027. So we are progressing in that direction. So in the beginning of 2023, when we had all those warm temperatures, the news would come out with these memes like, what is your wake-up call? The 7 hottest days on Earth, have been in the last 7 days. So like you just experienced them. But then the days kept going and it was always warmer. So it was 37 days all in a row that were the hottest ever on Earth. But then it came that the last 7 months had all been the hottest 7 months on Earth. And then I was trying to get it together for what was the temperature, for this year for my class. And it turns out that the last 10 years have been the 10 hottest years on Earth. So it's pretty serious. And we think there's speculation out there that's, will play out through the years, whether we have just gone through a point where the rate of warming is increasing. And it's looking like that may be a thing. But yeah, we are in the midst of the 4th mass global chloral bleaching event. We're at the point where the Arctic rivers are turning orange with the melting of at the same time as the permafrost is melting. These are both, this is something that you can see from outer space. Like if we don't have ice on the North Pole and the rivers are turning orange, these are things you can see. It's not like some scientist is in the corner doing some obscure calculation. They're saying something's a little bit different. Like we're changing the planet to the point that we can see changes from outer space. Okay, it's not minor. Okay, and then scientists, as they're thinking about this, they're thinking, as our job to inform people what's going on, we need to write articles like this could really have impact on societies and the potential for collapse. We're not saying that is going to happen, but we're saying as we look at the literature, we can say we're up to having 9 and 10 articles per year of different groups of scientists from throughout the globe that are considering that as a possible outcome and writing articles on it. And the same is true with the solar radiation modification. They're like, we may not get this under control. And if we can't get this under control, maybe we've got to add pollution to the atmosphere so not so much sun comes in, so that we can, not have global warming. And that one is so serious that we are getting up to 50 articles a year of scientists figuring out how we would implement adding pollution to the atmosphere to prevent so much incoming solar radiation. Okay. And then scientists, even though the Paris Agreement says we want to stay under 2 degrees Celsius, scientists, if you query them, they think, most of them would say we're going to get at least to 2.5 degrees Celsius. And some of them think we could get all the way up to 4 degrees Celsius, 4, 4.5, or 5. So, and it is, it's a global justice issue. I think the next slide shows it a little bit better, where the places that are the most vulnerable to climate change are the places that have the least impact, or the least, they have the fewest emissions. And you can plot this and say, these countries with the highest population, the highest emissions are really the least vulnerable. So it really is a social justice issue. And yeah, so, and we also have to worry about the feedback loops to the climate system. And we often tend to think of just one feedback loop, but we have a separate paper where we came up with, there's 27 different amplifying feedback loops. So when they're all going, then if just the wildfires can add CO2, that's going to add to warming. But if at the same time, that makes it even warmer, so the permafrost will melt more, then that's making it warmer. But so both the wildfires and the permafrost are both adding greenhouse gases. That's making it even warmer. So we have even more of the melting ice. And we're saying that there's 27 different of these amplifying feedback loops. Not all of them are considered in the current models. And so, it really is true. If humans disturb one thing, there will be a ripple effect. But these things are happening not just in one location, but all over the globe. And what we're concerned about is when we have these models and they say we're looking at the worst case and the best case scenarios, that the worst case scenario, that's just the worst case of what humans emit. The worst case scenarios that we are currently considering don't consider what if all of those 27 amplifying feedback loops are also in place. So we are not even considering that. And that might be part of why we're getting this acceleration of warming. So we are highly concerned. We think we're very glad this is one of your topics. And we really need to make progress on it. And I'm going to pass it over from there.
Hit mine up there.
Yeah.
There it is, hiding down there somewhere. There we go. And then I can just advance it with,
I've been using this arrow.
okay, that'll work.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Dr. Gregg. And Dr. Gregg did a nice introduction to what I want to say. I'm going to try to limit my remarks to about 10 minutes so that there are times for you to share your insights, your questions, your concerns. And these slides will be available. Talk to Tim and I can make sure that the slides I'm going to skip through really fast. So we get to kind of the meat of my talk and then give you a chance to, share your ideas. But Dr. Gregg ended with a comment about social justice, and that's a good transition to what I'm going to be sharing with you. So first of all, a communication professor in climate change maybe seems like a disconnect, but this is who I am. I've taught a course on international negotiation at Oregon State University since 1989. I followed the UN climate change negotiations for a great extent since the Kyoto Protocol. I participated in UN climate change meetings since 2009. Every COP since Copenhagen, over 50 meetings, given climate change talks around the world. I lead 2 observer teams at UN meetings. I'm an advisor to the UNFCCC's capacity building committee called the Paris Committee on Capacity Building, and I'm a regular participant observer at meetings of the UNFCCC's Adaptation Committee. So I'm heavily invested in the UN process, and to that point, I think the Busby article is really a good article. I really enjoyed reading it. But I want to talk about what he doesn't talk about. And I think that will be important. Instead of me taking on some of the issues, I think by and large, I agreed with much of what he said. There was one paragraph in there, though I think that relates to what I want to talk about, and that is why the developing countries value the COPs so much. It's because it gives them a platform to really articulate their ideas and their concerns in ways that the G20 meetings or the G7 or Davos, as is going on right now, would never allow. So it may be not as important to some of the developed countries, but it's very important to the developing countries. So I'm going to start real briefly, though, with this. I don't know how well you can see these pictures. Do you know where this is? Anybody want to guess where this is? I know it's kind of hard to see. The screen's a little light. Anybody have any? Joseph, Oregon is right. You're absolutely right. You get the free cup of coffee later. Now, the reason why I use Joseph, if you've never been to Joseph and Enterprise, make sure you go. Every person in the Pacific Northwest should visit there. Joseph has reinvented itself. What I see is Joseph is an example of a community that was timber dependent historically. When the Wallowa-Whitman National Forest under the Northwest Forest Plan cut back on its forest production, its vegetation management significantly, the town really had to come together and reinvent itself. Now, it hasn't reinvented itself as smoothly as it might, as perfectly as it might, but it's become a great place for artists, particularly metal sculpture. And so you see that a little bit here. And the reason why I use that, it gets at the concept of transition, which is what I want you to think about. Now, all of us go through transitions, personal, professional, organizational. You can all relate that to your own lives. But in the climate change world, there are transitions that are proactive and reactive. The proactive just transition, we seem to negotiate if we can at these COPs, at all these climate meetings that I go to. A lot of talk about just transition. Those of us who've lived in Oregon long enough to remember the Northwest Forest Plan of 1994, remember that in the Northwest Forest Plan, timber production on federal forest lands was going to drop by about 80%. And a lot of timber-dependent communities were very concerned, and so built into the Northwest Forest Plan was things like job retraining, which is part of just transition. But reactive is what happens after the terrible fires that are playing out in Los Angeles. And the understanding that we weren't as well prepared for the nature of those fires as we might have been. And so that we often wait and respond in transitions reactively after a crisis has occurred. And in the climate world, we need to spend more time thinking proactively. And we're going to talk about that in terms of human dimensions. Now, there are some slides here about just transition, but this is the one I want to highlight. When we transition, we do it in a fair and just and equitable way. That's the idea behind linking the word just or justice to transition. And there's transitioning economically, which may be obvious, right? We want to be able to provide opportunities for people to continue to support their families, to pursue a career. But there's also transitioning culturally, being responsive to cultural traditions. We're certainly in the Native American Center here at Portland State. We're well aware of the history of the Pacific Northwest and what our Native American communities have contributed to that. Transitioning restoratively, providing resources for the most vulnerable, and transitioning procedurally, which is where I do a lot of my work as a mediator and facilitator on environmental conflict situations. So we can think about that notion of justice. What I want to do is kind of skip through this. This is a great slide. If you follow as I do, if you're a news junkie like I am, there are a lot of headlines that have come out. You can see that. A lot of these relate directly to what Dr. Gregg shared with us, and they're in all sorts of different sources. And climate science, I'm a regular reader of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports. And if you haven't had a chance, they're great policy summaries. You don't have to read the every page, but you can read the policy summaries. They're accessible free on the web. And I'm interested more in climate social science, which has gained limited attention within the climate science community, although it's been increasing. It's significant within the NGO and academic communities. It's important to developing countries, and it's essential to climate policy and climate action. And it's something that BuzzBee does not really address, and that's why we're going to address it. So here's what I want to highlight real briefly. These are 8 areas of just transition that I say represent human dimensions, where we need to spend our time. And for any of you, I'm just curious, have any of you gone through the climate reality training of Al Gore? No, okay, we may want to, 2 of us have. Okay, we might talk about that. I'm a climate reality leader. I've gone through the training that this program that Vice President Al Gore started. They don't spend enough time on these issues. They're very science heavy. And what I've said is, yes, of course, climate science is absolutely critical, but if we're going to implement climate action, we have to pay attention to culture, indigenous rights, and knowledge. You can see the list, and I'm going to take you through those very, very quickly. Let's start with culture. The idea here is that if you don't pay attention culturally to the cultural traditions of a community, you can come up with an answer that simply isn't going to work. And it means that whether it's something that's spiritual or something that's symbolic or something that simply is traditional, to pay attention to the cultural norms, the cultural priorities wherever we're doing our climate action. Another one is indigenous rights and knowledge. And when the Paris Agreement was negotiated, this was a big issue for a lot of developing countries. And people wanted a separate article in the Paris Agreement on indigenous knowledge and indigenous rights. It didn't make it. It got in the preamble. It wasn't considered significant enough for a number of the negotiators to maintain its own article. But I work with the Paris Committee on capacity building on a regular basis, and this is a big issue that's happened. And more recently, the UNCCC has created something called Local Communities and the Indigenous Peoples Platform. It's now one of the subcommittees or constituted bodies, and it wasn't there 10 years ago. So that becomes an issue. Another one is gender. And again, when you go back to Kyoto Protocol, there's no mention of gender at all. But gender has emerged in the last 15 years, particularly under the leadership of Cristina Figueres, who was the executive secretary of the climate change regime. And the idea here is that if you think about our own lives around the world, what is a relative universal? It's not perfect in every country and every society, but more often than not, the agent of change at the local level is a woman. And it's in a variety of ways, and we could certainly talk about that. It doesn't mean we men are unimportant, but we've not paid enough attention to women as leaders, to women in critical areas. And so gender now is incorporated into much of what these UN meetings address. Another one is youth. We obviously have to pay attention to youth, and the youth are very prominent in these UN negotiations, very influential. And again, that influence has increased in the 30 years that I've been, or almost 30 years I've been following the talks, and the last 15 years that I've been attending. There's also the issue of collaboration or conflict resolution and peace building. That's where I do a lot of my work. I've been doing environmental conflict resolution work for over 30 years. And how do we pay attention to that and bring that in, knowing that conflicts are inherent when we try to implement climate policy? There are going to be people who have different priorities and different interests. There's also this importance of communication, not just because I'm a communication professor, but how do we communicate the science, for example, that Dr. Gregg has mentioned? One of my favorite people in the climate communication world is a professor named Katharine Hayhoe. If you want to read some work of somebody really good, Katharine Hayhoe is an amazing person. She's an evangelical Christian and doesn't compromise her faith. She's an amazing scientist. She's the climate advisor to the Nature Conservancy. She's a professor at Texas Tech University. She's also an amazing person as a writer and speaker to be able to communicate the relevance of science to people's everyday lives. Then in addition to that is education. And this may be obvious, but we need to incorporate more climate science and climate policy into education, really at all levels, in a way that recognizes that the climate is changing and we can be proactive about it, we can anticipate it, we can deal with certainly the notion of transition, resilience, and adaptation. And then an area that I do a lot of my work is participatory governance. I have been a mediator and facilitator in the environmental policy arena for over 30 years, currently working with the Montana Forest Collaboration Network and their facilitators, helping them work through conflicts related to forest management. Done that for a long time, and we need to bring this idea of shared governance, participatory governance into the development of climate policy and climate action. Now, I'm going to wrap things up briefly, if I'm looking at my watch here, just in a minute or two. This is something that I'm invested in and may be of interest to you. Is it relevant to Portland or Corvallis or Salem or Scappoose? And the answer might be, oh, no, this is only relative to Philippines and Bangladesh. I think it's relevant to everybody. I presented these at a workshop recently in Montana to people who are members of the Montana Forest Collaboration Network. And you can say, what are the principles that we need to follow when we're truly trying to implement just and fair and equitable climate action? And I'm not going to go through all of these in detail. You can see them, but look at this first one, devolving decision-making at the lowest level. Or this one, addressing structural inequalities faced by women, youth, children, disabled, displaced, indigenous peoples. And then all the way over to collaborative action and investing. These have been developed by a number of organizations, and this locally led adaptation has become a very, very powerful driver to developing countries around the world. I've done some work in Bangladesh, and Bangladesh is at the leading edge of this effort, as are other highly vulnerable countries. So I'm going to skip to this and end this way. What does this have to do with the UNFCCC negotiations? Well, just transition and human dimensions, they weren't there in the 90s at all. They got some attention in the 2000s. They're a minor part of the Paris Agreement. They're much more prominent now, but they're still limited attention in many NDCs. And for those of you who remember reading that article or follow this, every country under the Paris Agreement develops an NDC, a nationally determined contribution. It's basically a climate action plan. And just transition and the human dimensions that I've mentioned, by and large, don't appear prominently in most, if not all, NDCs. What's going to happen in Bonn? I'll be in Bonn for 2 weeks in June. I'll be in Belém in November. We're going to see that these issues are becoming increasingly prominent. Just Transition now has, in fact, a work program, and there's this group called Action for Climate Empowerment that I've been involved with that does a number of things: education, training, public awareness, public participation. The last thing I'll mention is that what is it that any of us can do? There are ways that we can get involved. And one of the ways that I've mentioned this is, as agents of change, you and I can influence climate action plans. Portland has one. Multnomah County has one. These are simply some examples. Phoenix, Arizona, Mesa, Arizona. They spend very little attention on matters of justice, of human dimensions, of just transition. Most climate action plans are fundamentally about reducing greenhouse gas emissions, reducing the carbon footprint of a city, all for good. But we know that on an everyday basis, if you and I are going to be part of a movement to make climate change, climate action a priority in this country, it means that we've got to certainly not only educate ourselves, but be part of those conversations with our neighbors in ways that can relate to their work. I'm going to end with a story. My students will tell you I'm a storyteller. And just to give you a little background, I've been a teacher for 51 years. I'm 73 years old. I'm retiring in end of February from Oregon State, 38 years at Beaver Tech, as I like to call it. It's been a wonderful place to work, but my students will tell you I tell way too many stories. I'm going to tell you one. So I had the privilege to work in Sublette County, Wyoming. That's Pinedale. This is the north end of a big oil and gas basin. So this economy is based in part on oil and gas. I was hired by the governor of Wyoming to help start a community-based forest collaborative in Sublette County. This is just before COVID. And I was sitting one day in a coffee shop with one of the elder ranchers who was about 80. Conservative guy. I'm pretty sure I could tell you who he voted for. And we're having coffee. And I said to him, I got some questions for you. His name was Daryl. I said, Daryl, I got some questions for you. You've been ranching. You're what, fourth, fifth generation? Oh, yeah, we've had this ranch for 100 plus years. I said, well, what have you seen changes? I said, tell me the changes you've seen in running your cattle. He said, well, you know, that we're not getting as much rain. Oh, you're not getting as much rain. What about the snowpack? Oh, it's not as good as it used to be. Well, what about the AUMs where you're running your cattle on federal land? Yeah, we got to go up a little bit higher because the vegetation down low isn't as healthy anymore. And he went through a whole series of things. I looked at him, I said, you think any of this has to do with changes in climate? And he looked at me and he said, you got me. The point is, I started with what he knew, his local knowledge, his indigenous knowledge, his traditional knowledge, use whatever term you want. And I did it in a way that then created the conversation. I said to him, look, you and I can sit here and we can debate the science. And I said, I can tell you, I believe the science is a strong scientific consensus. I can tell you articles to read, but let's talk about how you adapt. Let's talk about how you improve your resilience. Let's talk about how you transition. And we had a great conversation. So we started with where he was at and related the climate crisis to his livelihood, to things that he valued. And that's a message that I'll leave with you. So again, thank you for giving Dr. Gregg and me a few minutes to chat with you about our ideas. I probably went a little bit longer than I should have. I've got some people here. I will end with one thing. I get asked a lot. I fly around the world. I go to all these meetings and my students say, oh, you're burning carbon. You know, they're right. But what I've done, if you've ever heard of the person Wangari Maathai, she's one of the heroes in my life. She won the Nobel Peace Prize a number of years ago. She passed away a few years ago. She was the first woman in East Africa to earn a PhD in any field. And then she became an activist. She ran for parliament in Kenya. She started a foundation called the Greenbelt Movement. I give them thousands of dollars every year to reduce my guilt. So just want to say, I'll put in a plug for the Greenbelt Movement. If you're looking for what I think is a really important foundation that's working in this area. So I'm going to stop there and look at our name. See, you know that if we go to the UK, Dr. Gregg, that our names are all over the place. There are all these shops that are Gregg. So I'll stop there. Thank you for your time. Let's have some questions for Dr. Gregg or for me, or your comments, anything you want to chat about. And I can't speak for Dr. Gregg, but I paid for parking till about 3 o'clock. So I can hang around once we're formally done.
Great. Thank you both. It was great to hear you mention two people that we have actually brought to Portland as speakers over the years. Wangari Maathai spoke for our International Speaker Series, as did Catherine Hayhoe.
Oh my goodness.
And one of the reasons that we brought Catherine Hayhoe was exactly what you're talking about, which is meeting people where they're at on a complex topic that can so easily be dismissed. And one of my memories of her, one was her ability to break things down in such a way. She was talking about the difference between, say, climate and weather. But, you know, she is an evangelical Christian, which I think was a challenge for a Portland audience, you know, having been voted, you know, the most godless city in the US before. But I do think it's important to challenge our own assumptions, especially on issues like this. And at one point, she said, when people ask me if I believe in climate change, I say, no, I do not, because it is not up for debate. It is a fact. She said, I believe in God. And I thought that was a very interesting sort of distinction. So in your slide there, you had some things. You had human rights, you had inequality, you have gender, you have indigenous rights, climate reality, conservation, renewable technology, peace building. All of these things are in essence a little bit threatened now with the US stepping away from Paris, which is a major blow to, you know, climate leadership. What can a room full of people like this do to amplify the need and the urgency and the responsibility to steward change in the face of obfuscation or denial or just a complete disavowal of the crisis?
Well, let me answer it this way. Would you like to hear what one of these COPs is like? Because it kind of answers the question. I brought some students to COPs. I lead 2 NGOs. Every year I go, I have new people who've never been before. And of course, it's just overwhelming. A COP is like a carnival. Imagine a carnival with 4 big tents. 4 big tents. One tent is the negotiations. They're incredibly slow and often are very frustrating because all the wordsmithing that goes on. You may have heard that the Paris Agreement relied in part on using the word shall versus should. Maybe you heard that story. If not, it had to do with John Kerry saying, if we have the term shall in that, then it has to go to Congress for approval, which wasn't going to happen. If we say the US should, well, then it can be an executive action. I know that sounds kind of silly, but the lawyers got involved. So they're a wordsmith. They'll say, should it be shall or should? They'll go talk about this for a long time. So this is negotiations. Very discouraging. I always say to my students, when you're going to come out of those negotiations depressed because things aren't happening that fast. This is an urgent situation. It's a crisis. And I say, okay, go across the hall. Go to the pavilions. The pavilions are under the other tent, kind of the second tent, and they're run by countries and NGOs. And they're filled with presentations and exhibits on climate actions that are happening all around the world. And it's very uplifting to see what's happening, where organizations, NGOs, and local governments aren't waiting for national governments or international agreements to get things done. Then we go to another one. It's called side events. Side events are more formal presentations. I've presented at a number of them over the years. Again, where people are giving papers, a lot like a research conference or an academic conference. They're giving papers on their research on climate science, on climate policy. Again, a very positive atmosphere. Then the fourth one are exhibits, and my organizations always have a booth for Mediators Beyond Borders International and the International Environmental Communication Association. Those are the two I work with. We have a booth and people come up and we talk about communication, we talk about mediation, we talk about conflict, but there will be 200 organizations that have booths. So what happens then is that you and I can get involved in any of those. What I always say to people, and my students included, find an NGO where you can be a participant and influence the Portland or Multnomah County or Clackamas County Climate Action Plan. Get that in there. Pay attention to human dimensions. And I'm getting a signal for time. So anyway, so that's kind of a long answer, but it gives you a sense of what happens at these COPs.
Very much appreciate your both of your remarks. I think my question is, I appreciate the importance of social justice as you're addressing some of the climate issues, but the first speaker spoke to the urgency. And you're beginning to see the public debate begin to move away from social justice considerations to how do I get my insurance policies covered? And the fact that insurance has entered the conversation injects a reality that pushes almost everything else aside. But my question is, if we're in a sense of urgency, then can we really afford, let's say, the Yucca Mountain debate if we need to introduce nuclear as a piece of a carbon-free energy basis? Can we afford a long debate around establishing a lithium mine in Southern Oregon, Northern Nevada, if that's something that is supporting an energy transition? So it's really, can you speak to the urgency impacting the social justice argument? Thank you.
Dr. Gregg, you want to go for that or should I give it a while?
You should start out.
Oh,
go ahead.
Oh, well, no, it's a great point. And it's one of the reasons why I think it's important that we have opportunities for people to come together in a kind of a participatory governance arena and be able to what I would say deal with their kind of what I call future scenarios, whether it's a lithium mine or whether it's an insurance crisis. You're absolutely right. And be able to set priorities and say, these are issues. I think the insurance is a great example. We're seeing that in Florida. We're seeing that in California, where insurance companies are leaving the state or they won't write insurance policies for wildfire or for hurricanes, or the cost of it is so expensive, it's prohibitive. And then I think a part of the question, I know this varies politically, I think it's important to have a conversation about the role of government. I spent a lot of time in Denmark and I've been over there many, many times. I've been a guest professor over there and have friends there and work with people in Denmark. And when COVID hit in Denmark, the political divide came together. They said, you know, we're divided over immigration in Denmark, as they are in much of Europe, just as we are in this country. But when it came to public health and the COVID crisis, the conservatives and the liberals all got together and said, this is not a partisan issue. And my students at Oregon State, many of whom are pretty conservative, have told me the same thing. They think the climate crisis shouldn't be politicized, shouldn't be partisan. So how do we create forums here in Portland or in Medford or in Klamath Falls or in Scappoose or in Astoria where people can come together? I'm a real advocate for town hall conversations, something called the World Cafe. Maybe you're familiar with that approach, where we do that and we bring people together. We do this in Corvallis through the Corvallis Sustainability Coalition. We bring people together to be able to set local priorities and have a frank conversation about not just what we'd like to see happen, but how can we make it happen? And what is the role for government, whether it's local or federal, when it comes to things like insurance, or when it comes to things like mining safety, restarting nuclear energy, or lithium mining for electric, whatever it is. I think you're onto something. And that to me is why I like the term human dimensions, because the human dimension concept is very dynamic, and it means whatever it means to you should be part of our conversation. I'm not sure that answers your question, but that I've given that some thought. I think it's a great point.
Is another question?
We have another question, but if you want to, did you want to jump in? You want to ask the question?
Let's hear the question first.
You mentioned gender and youth among important things. And in these international, like COPs, I imagine the developed countries probably carry a lot of weight. Well, the developing countries have a much higher percentage of youth. Do the youth carry enough weight?
Well, have you seen it in your work that there's younger scientists, for example, getting involved? Like when you think of the group that signed all these letters, is there a youth component to that or a young scientist?
I hadn't noticed it within scientists, but we are very excited that the Held versus Montana case went
Oh, yeah,
through just
yeah.
2 weeks ago. So they had gone through back in 2023. And so they're one of these, there's the Youth v. Gov, the Juliana case. At the national level, it hasn't gone through. It hasn't, they haven't been able to even hear their case. But the Montana case went through, and actually, there's a similar case that I always felt like, oh, well, you can't really be part of Sunrise unless you're under 33, and you can't be, you can't be part of the youth movement because you're not a youth. But the Swiss, I don't know if you've heard about the senior Swiss women who they just won a case. And their point was that we are elderly and we are being more impacted by heat waves. And so we are not being, our rights are not being listened to. And so there's room in the US to have some senior climate cases if you guys wanted to do that. And anything that can change the finances, that you can support some actual companies that are trying to get actual solar or wind in place currently. I think it's a great environment for youth that are gonna, or the young people who are getting out of college. They can start a business. It could be nearly funded by the Inflation Reduction Act. If you guys are not familiar, probably this group is, with ways that you can, they're just giving money away with the Inflation Reduction Act. And I'm not hearing that it's going to be canceled, that there's indications that it might stay in place. And so the way to find out how you can make money, make money off of that is you go to rewireamerica.com, and it tells you all the different ways that you can save money by having solar on your house or buying, buying an EV, and thousands of dollars are being given away. And so you should make sure and be on top of that, and help support companies that are getting off the ground. I mean, it's definitely the way of the future. So
I'll just add to that at these COPs, yeah, it's amazing how many young people are there from developing countries. And the United Nations and a number of NGOs have tried to find some money to help young people from developing countries come to these COPs. And they're organized as one of the 9 constituencies. They're called the Youngos, and you can learn about them if you just Google Youngo UNFCCC. It's the youth NGO community, and they're very active and very influential. I mean, they're more influential than me. I think the younger people are, and for good reason, that they're going to be on this earth a lot longer than I'm going to be here. And I see this in my students as well. And I get asked a lot of how can I stay optimistic? And I think it's because I'm around young people who are simply saying, we've got to deal with this. This is the next 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 years of our lives, and we've got to deal with it. And then I make sure my grandkids are active.
And back to that scientist question, I think that youth that really want something to happen, they don't need more science. They're going to be going into action in companies and making things happen. I don't think they're wanting more science. Yeah.
But you're teaching a lot more
undergraduates
than I am.
Yeah, they want action. They want to go and be part of the Youth v. Gov or help an actual cause. Yeah.
Having worked out of the NGO community for 35 years on human rights and environmental issues, et cetera, I've also participated in the COPs and everything. And when I hear you talk about Carnival, I view it as a bubble of a carnival. And the issue is when we're really dealing with those issues, we're dealing with questions of power and interest. And I just wish you could address that. I mean, in the sense, I've worked with the social movements and environment in South America and Central America, only to have those leaders assassinated.
and also working on finance to try to force companies to come around. But they have political power and legal power. And I don't want to take the air out of what you're saying, but how do you address the power equation? Because it's not just human rights. Rights doesn't address the power equation. How would you address it?
I think he was looking at you.
Well, I think you're right. Why is it that human rights wound up in the preamble of the Paris Agreement rather than an article? It had to do with who the power players were and what they thought was most important. I think it takes collective action. I think it takes grassroots action. I think the change is going to come from the ground level, but you have to deal with the political realities that are there. You can't be naive about the power dynamics that are there. And you're absolutely right. I mean, there are people who have a vested interest in keeping the climate crisis going. There are people who have a vested interest in conflict going on, and we can't be naive about that. And that's where you have to address that. I think you confront power as strategically as you can, and it often occurs through some kind of collective action and people willing to take risks. And it is risky, and the people in power want us to remain passive. And if we remain passive, we become enablers to that kind of political dangerous power. I think that's a longer conversation that we could have, but I think you raised an important point.
It's interesting that the ultimate power is who is going to be able to provide the power in the future. And it's very smart of China to be the leader in all of the renewable energies. And for the life of me, I don't know why we don't see that as a market that we should be competing in and in trying to make sure we are the leader. And, that's not our strategy. And I don't see that as a good idea.
If only you ran the carnival. So, big hand for Jillian, Gregg Walker. Just as a little aside, they are not beavers, but they are ducks. Our Children's Trust is a really important organization.
Yeah.
I think that problem solving and the recognition of crises like global warming, Oregon was very, very early to recognizing that and thinking out of what that meant from a policy stance. But that idea of who gets to wield power or who has access to power, the work of Our Children's Trust, I think, was pretty revolutionary because it was giving young people the a right and an access to power that they didn't have because they weren't old enough to vote, but they could hold our elected officials and our municipalities accountable for the decisions they make for future generations. And this was called atmospheric trust litigation. This goes back to ancient public trust laws that were in place around the time of the Magna Carta. So look up Our Children's Trust. I think they do fantastic work. Juniana is one of those. That's one of the cases that Jillian mentioned. We've actually had them speak as well.
Of course.
Mary Christina Wood is the woman who wrote Nature's Trust. She is an incredible thinker. And this was a mechanism that we all can actually put in our hands. And there's a modicum of power that can be wielded by using a legal system for the sake of our planet. So just a little thought there. Wanted to remind you, grab a Bridge Together card on your way out. I also do have a sign-up sheet if you want to join our Great Decisions discussion group. I've got about 6 people signed up. I'm going to reach out to you all this coming week, and we're going to figure out a where and a when and a how, and we'll do that. And again, thank you all. These will be on YouTube after the fact, and we'll see you all next week. Thanks.
And I'll mention one thing briefly too. I'm a member of the Climate Reality Leadership Corps. I give pro bono talks all over the world. I do it on Zoom. I do it in person. I've gone on paid pro bono speaking tours at universities. If you're a civic group, if you're a community group, if you're a church group, ever wants a speaker to have a conversation about any of this climate stuff, by all means, contact me. And as I said, I'm technically retired from Oregon State in about 6 weeks. So what do I do then? But I'm happy to do it. Or if you want to learn more about climate reality, by all means, let's chat about it. You've already learned I'm Walker the Talker. Happy to have the conversation. So. The opportunity to share ideas. Yeah. Really great. And, well, I was coming back from the comp in Warsaw in 2013. And I got upgraded business. Sits next to me, Michael Mann.
Oh.